As you know, reproduction is one of the 8 characteristics of living things, but there's actually more than one way of reproducing. You can split up organisms into ones that reproduce asexually and ones that reproduce sexually. Although a lot of organisms actually can do both types of reproduction, especially plants. Now we'll look at asexual reproduction first. Now in asexual reproduction, usually cells in one part of the body divide by mitosis, which type of cell division, which we'll talk about in the other video on cell division. But really what happens there is cells copy themselves and make more identical copies of the same cell. And then those identical copies might break off and form the new organism. But it's a genetically identical copy of the parent organism. Now, asexual reproduction actually happens in all types of organisms. Happens in this one here. You can see this is yeast, which type of fungus. You can see it reproducing. See the little baby sort of yeast, as it were, budding off the parent yeast cells there. Bacteria, you can see a bacteria splitting there. This is some E. coli, so that's doing asexual reproduction. This is actually a type of animal called a hydra which can do asexual reproduction. And there's things like runners on strawberries, which is an example of asexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction is different because what you have here is you need sex cells. You need things called gametes. You need a male gamete and a female gamete. In asexual reproduction, there was no male, there's no female. There's just a parent and the offspring. And the offspring is a direct copy of the parent. Here, we've got 2 parents. We've got a male gamete and we've got a female gamete coming. And they need to join together, they fuse together to form the offspring, form this new cell, which is called fertilization. And that new cell is called a zygote. It's not only animals that do sexual reproduction. As you'll find out in the other video, flowering plants also do sexual reproduction as well. Now once you form this zygote, here you've got the egg cell, you've got the sperm cell, they fuse together, they form a zygote. Then that cell needs to divide and divide and divide and divide and divide. It does that via mitosis, which is a type of copying of cells, like making photocopies. So you just make more and more copies of the same cell until you form that embryo. Now in humans, the male gametes are sperm, and those are produced in the testes. And in female, the gametes are called ova, which are produced in the ovaries. Now those cells are special cells. Ova and sperm are produced via something called meiosis, and that's because meiosis produces cells that are not genetically identical. It also produces cells which have half the number of chromosomes in. So these gamete cells with half the number of chromosomes are called haploid cells. A typical human cell has 46 chromosomes in, and we call that cell a diploid cell. But if we joined a diploid cell with a diploid cell, we'd end up with too many chromosomes. So what you need to have is you need to have cells, gamete cells, sperm and egg, that have half the normal number in, so that when they fuse together, we go back to that full number of 46 again. We get a diploid cell. So that makes sure that the zygote is a diploid cell. Humans can only reproduce sexually, but in the wider world, many animal and plant species use both types of reproduction. Aphids, strawberries, and there's another plant there called the devil's backbone. Lots of plants especially can use sexual or asexual reproduction. So this table summarizes nicely the 2 different types of reproduction. There's 10 true or false questions here that you can have a go at to check your understanding on the types of reproduction. So plants can reproduce sexually and asexually, or actually both. There are pros and cons to both methods, and each species has evolved a method that works best for them. Sexual reproduction is more complex, but it increases variation and may help the plant to adapt to changing environments. Asexual reproduction is very simple, but it only really works well in a good, stable environment, as there's no variation in the offspring. So we'll look at asexual reproduction in plants first. Plants have adopted many different ways of carrying out asexual reproduction, but most involve some part of the parent plant growing and then breaking away to form the new plant. A great example of this, an example you know about, is strawberries. With a strawberry plant, if you look carefully, there'll be a special type of shoot that comes out at a different at an angle off the side called a runner, and it will go a foot and a half from the parent plant, and then it will drop down and it will hit the soil and it will start to form its own roots and its own leaves. And then the runner will detach, and essentially what that plant has just done is cloned itself, and that's a type of asexual reproduction. All the new cells that are produced in asexual reproduction are produced by mitosis, therefore they are all identical, there is no genetic variation. Gardeners have taken advantage of this for ages. What they can do is they take things called cuttings, where they actually chop off a bit of a parent plant and stick it in the soil, and that will grow into a copy of the parent plant. So you've got a really expensive rose, you can take lots of cutting from it and make lots of copies of that same rose, and that's just doing asexual reproduction, but doing it artificially yourself. Sexual reproduction, much more interesting, more complex, but much more interesting for plants. For sexual reproduction, you need to have gametes, you need to have sex cells, and in the plant, the gametes are pollen grains for male and ova for the female part of the plant. Now, plants are funny because you don't have male plants and female plants, not like humans. Flowering plants, they have both the male bits and the female bits. So the plant will produce both pollen and ova, but obviously it doesn't really want to just mate with itself, because that's not going to be very helpful. So you still want the male bits from one flower to go to the female bits of another one. Okay, so you still want plants to breed, but the plants will produce both male and female gametes. And remember, gametes are haploid cells. They've got half the number of chromosomes, so when they fuse together to form the zygote, that will go back to the full number of chromosomes. Now, in order to get the male gamete from the male part of a flower to the female part of another flower, you need something to transfer the pollen. Something's got to take the pollen from one place to the other. Okay, there's no sexual intercourse in plants. Plants don't have big penises that come out and wave around and stick into other flowers. That would be a bit strange. They actually use bees or insects, or sometimes birds, to carry the pollen from one place, one flower to another. Or they use the wind. They produce loads and loads of pollen, throw it up into the air, and hope that the wind wafts it and makes the pollen land on a female part of another flower. Now, that process of pollen moving from one flower to another is called pollination. Following pollination, you want fertilization to happen. You want the pollen to fuse with an egg, and you want the zygote to form, and eventually that will form a seed, which is basically like a little baby plant, and that will get enclosed in a fruit, and that will then help with the seed to be dispersed and hopefully then germinate and then grow into the adult plant. So what we're going to do is we're going to work through these different processes, and we'll keep coming back to this summary to remind ourselves of how far we are on the journey of how a plant reproduces. We've got gamete formation, making the pollen, making the eggs, pollination, which is how the male gamete gets the female one, then fertilization when they fuse together, then you make the seed and the fruit, then you disperse that seed, and hopefully then you get the germination and the offspring being fully produced. So what we're going to do is we're going to work through these different processes, and we'll keep coming back to this summary to remind ourselves of how far we are on the journey of how a plant reproduces. We've got gamete formation, making the pollen, making the eggs, pollination, which is how the male gamete gets the female one, then fertilization when they fuse together, then you make the seed and the fruit, then you disperse that seed, and hopefully then you get the germination and the offspring being fully produced. Now, in order to understand this process, we've got to look at the anatomy of a flower, and we've got to go through the different parts and what their roles are. So first of all, we'll start with the male bits. Now, the male bits of a flower are the anther and the filament. and collectively they're known as the stamen. The anther is where the pollen is produced, and the filament just holds that anther in position there. And there's usually quite a lot of anthers producing lots and lots of pollen. We've also got the petals. Obviously the petals are there to entice in the insects, the bees and things like that, to say, look over here, come and get some nectar, which will be down at the bottom of the flower for them to come and get. And it just so happens that when they come in to get the nectar, the nice sugary drink, they rub against some of the pollen, and they then will fly off to another flower and deposit that pollen there. Where they'll deposit the pollen is on the female part of the flower, and they'll deposit it at the stigma, which is the top bit there of the flower in the center. The stigma is connected to the ovary via the style, and the ovary is where you'll find the ovules, and inside the ovules is where you find the actual ova, the eggs. And together, all the female bits is called the carpel. So that's where gametes are produced. The pollen is produced in the anther, and the ova are found inside the ovules. So how does pollination occur then? Well, I said either it can happen via a insect or via the wind. But what has to happen is the pollen has to be transferred from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another. Then it would be called cross-pollination. Occasionally you can get self-pollination where flowers pollinate themselves, but like I said, it's not ideal. So we really want to go from one flower to another. Now, when you look at pollination, you realise there's actually two types of flowers. You probably never noticed the second type of flowers because they're pretty boring. You will have noticed insect pollinated flowers. They've got a beautiful colour, big petals, and they produce the nice smell, the scent. You probably never really noticed wind pollinated flowers. You see these really on things like grasses. That's because they don't have nice petals, they don't have a scent, they don't use insects, so there's no point producing them. So we can compare and contrast the structures of insect pollinated flowers and wind pollinated flowers. So insect pollinated flowers, they've got bright petals, as I said, for attracting insects. They've got scent, they have a sticky stigma for the pollen to stick to, and they've got the anthers there, and they're all enclosed inside that flower so the insect rubs against them. They also produce nectar for the actual insects to have as their meal. That's their treat for going to the flower. If you look at a wind pollinated flower, very different. No bright petals, no scent, no nectaries, big stigma which is all kind of feathery, and that's to catch the pollen as it floats across in the wind. Also the anthers dangle down outside of the main flower so that again the wind hits them and knocks all that pollen off. The pollen grains themselves are very inflated and small, so they get carried by the wind and blown long distances. So here's a really important table. There's so many questions that come up in the IGCSE about the comparing and contrasting these two types of flower and how they are adapted for different types of pollination.